Story number 1. I have seen enough in my years as a pastor to know the difference between a disturbed mind and something truly inexplicable. My days at St. Anthony's Church had always followed a dependable routine: early morning prayers, counseling troubled souls, organizing records, finishing lonely paperwork after evening services. I took comfort in these patterns, in the certainty that nothing at the church was ever truly out of place, or so I believed. It was late autumn when I first encountered something that unsettled my tidy world. I had stayed late that Wednesday, sorting through tattered donation receipts and old confession ledgers long after the choir had left. The church loomed large and quiet all around me, its cold stone and stained glass made even chillier by the unending silence that fell once the last visitor had gone. As a rule, doors were always locked firmly by 8. No one but I remained. I was halfway through alphabetizing parishioners' correspondence when a sharp metallic tap echoed from the confessional at the back of the nave. I looked up. The confessional box was tucked into an alcove with no windows, only a meager trickle of hallway light creeping in. I thought perhaps a forgotten choir boy, or, less likely, a homeless man seeking warmth. I called out, but no echo returned. The church, already cold, somehow seemed to swallow the sound. A shiver, unexplained, washed down my spine. It was then I felt the unmistakable caress of moving air, icy, sharp, carrying the faint scent of ancient incense and something earthier underneath. It brushed over my cheeks, ruffling the pages before me, yet there had been no open window, no door ajar. I pressed the record book closed and forced myself to walk toward the source. Inside the confessional, the air pulsed with an unnatural chill. Every breath felt wrong, heavy, like inhaling fog. I peered inside, saw nothing, no shifting shadow, no crouched figure. But after a heartbeat, a pressure behind me mounted, weightless but dense, as if someone stood too close for comfort, yet didn't quite touch me. I pivoted and my nerves shrieked in protest. A man stood there unmoving, his skin stretched thin over his skull, veins threading blue and purple on his face and hands. His eyes were a grotesque parody of fear and malice, stretched wide, whites glistening, the irises too bright. He did not seem to breathe, but there was an urgency in his stance, a quiet despair. He asked in a voice nearly as empty as the crypts below, to confess. Skepticism wrestled with duty inside me, old instincts pulling me toward the confessional proper. The man entered and sat with a stiffness that almost seemed inhuman. I slid into my side, my heart thudding audibly against my ribs. Through the fragile grill, darkness pressed. The man began to speak, halting at first, then racing, guttural tones flooding the booth. The sound soon shifted, growing deep and savage, as if the words passed over not lips but jaws better fit for rending than prayer. He confessed to murder, describing every detail with the clinical calm of someone relating a weather report. There was no hint of regret, only a feverish anticipation as he described the act, how the victim's heart sputtered out and how blood stilled in their veins. When I dared to look through the crisscross net, his face had changed. Those bulging eyes shone, no ordinary reflection, but a fierce, disorientingly bright red light which caught in the mesh and danced on its edges. My skin prickled. Years of training abandoned me. I grabbed for the confessional door. It was securely fastened. It rattled in its frame, and a desperate panic clawed at my throat. Above the beastly confession, moaning sounds rose, bestial and raw, not entirely human. From beneath the partition, something slid across the floor. A hand, elongated, fingers splayed wide. The man was no longer sitting, but crawling, folding and unfolding toward me, mouth distending, eyes pulsing with impossible color. I pressed myself against the wall, trying not to scream as he drew near. I felt breath on my cheek, harsh and hot, the scent metallic and earthy. With a sudden snap, the space grew silent again. I squeezed my eyes shut. When I opened them, he was gone. The confessional door clicked open with a casual finality. There was no one outside, no sign of forced entry or any intruder. The wintry breeze had stilled. I told myself that perhaps my tired mind had conjured it, a trick of shadow, a subtle current in the old stone building. Maybe even the resurgence of a repressed story from a parishioner's confession. But no matter how many reasonable answers I told myself, the feeling of malice lingered, stuck to me like old sweat. The nightmares started immediately. Every night I reenacted the confession, but this time from the victim's side. The room in my mind twisted and lengthened until the shadows grew thick. The pale man would always return, sometimes snatching me from behind the booth, sometimes slicing my neck with cold, deliberate care, sometimes burying his face into my chest and tearing out my heart. I'd jolt awake, sweat slicking my back, even with the air conditioning humming. The room would be so cold I could see my breath float above me, but the dread clinging to my skin was swampy and hot. Every so often, when walking back from the church in the late hours, I caught him, just out of frame, standing rigid by an alley's mouth or beneath a burnt-out street lamp, staring with two wide eyes that glimmered crimson in the dark, only to disappear when I looked twice. I would try to convince myself his face was only memory, an invention of a mind sharpened by fear and long nights, a shadow attached to some guilty conscience from past counseling sessions. But there was always a catch: the scent of old incense lingering on my coat, the bruised handprints on my forearms where he had not touched me. I reported nothing. I tried to pray the unease away, reason it away, steep my brain in skepticism. Maybe it was a vivid hallucination, sleep deprivation, exposure to too many troubled souls. Maybe the late October winds carried tricks of temperature through old stone and light through ancient glass. The mind does play tricks, and memory is unreliable. So many books and so many faces over the years. Yet still, some nights, lying rigid in my bed, I feel the same icy wind brush my face, the certainty that someone stands behind me, waiting. It may all be in my mind, but I cannot wholly convince myself that it is. Story number 2. I wish I could explain what happened that night in the old church, but every time I try to piece it together, I get this cold, shivering sensation in my bones. Growing up in our little village, the church was always an eyesore, its jagged outline cut into the night like a saw against flesh. People whispered about it, but as far as I knew, it was just another crumbling relic of the past, not worth the effort it took to fear it. My parents had died young, and I didn't have many friends. There was only one boy around my age who I sometimes hung out with. His name was Jax. He was braver than me when it came to these things, always egging me on. Late summer, Jax dared me to go inside the church with him. The moon was hidden behind clouds, and we cycled over the uneven roads, wheels crunching loose gravel that echoed through the sleeping village. No dogs barked as we approached the iron gate. That should have been a warning in itself. Animals always seemed to give the ruins a wide berth. By 11 p.m., we were inside. Every step we took caused the floorboards to whine and shift with age. My small flashlight flickered in the chilled air as we entered the nave. It was darker than I'd imagined, the sort of darkness that presses against your skin. I aimed my torch at the walls, and that's when I noticed the drawings. They looked freshly scratched into the plaster, lines rough and urgent. The pictures were violent, stick figures, roughly humanoid, tumbling over each other in chaos, some with arms raised holding jagged crimson shapes. It took a second to realize the red wasn't paint. No, it wasn't glossy. It flaked like dried rust, like congealed blood. And the hacking sounds, distant, metallic, could have been an animal outside, or maybe just my heart. I let out a nervous laugh, convincing myself we'd taken a detour and ended up in an old storeroom used as a horror prop by village kids. All theater, right? But then I noticed the statues of saints and angels along the side walls. Every one of them decapitated, marble heads lying at unnatural angles in the dust, blank eyes staring nowhere. Goose flesh broke over my skin. I turned to point it out to Jax, heart racing, but the space behind me was empty. I called out down the nave, my voice a thin scratch in all that darkness. No answer, just the echo bouncing off the walls. My pulse clawed at my throat. I stumbled toward the doorway, thinking maybe Jax was playing the kind of prank old friends are supposed to play. Outside, the landscape was barely visible beyond the sagging rafters and smashed glass. I thought I saw a shape moving among the trees, but when I shone my flashlight, all I got were deep shadows and the glint of gravestones. Running back inside, I scanned the church. The air seemed colder now, my breath fogging in the narrow cone of my beam. I felt as if the carved marble angels tracked me as I moved, a trick of the flashlight, or maybe the detailed way their eyes had been sculpted. But wherever I shifted, their blank, broken gaze followed, as if the statues were holding a silent, collective breath. I could feel the place alive around me, the tattered curtains shifting without wind, the smell of damp, iron, and powdered marble. My skin itched with every step I took. That's when I heard it. My name echoed from the altar. Jax's voice, unmistakable, only this time it was flat, hollow, like he was speaking around a mouthful of cotton. I raised my torch to call out to him, but something in me froze. I stared ahead, and there it was, slapped onto a wall in desperate letters. Never look behind. A part of me wanted to laugh it off, like the rest. But in that airless moment, I couldn't. My gut twisted, my mouth went dry. I realized my legs had locked, and though another voice called my name, I couldn't make my head turn. I think now, something primal kept me from moving. Suddenly my eyes burned, unbearably. I gasped, the pain like someone pouring chili into my open eyes, fiery agony that made me stagger. Tears poured, but nothing soothed the scald. The darkness that came wasn't an absence of light. It was something layered, suffocating, pressing on my eyeballs. The next thing I remember is the cold, hard surface beneath me and the shriek of crows. Blinking pain from my eyes, I realized I was lying among broken gravestones, weeds growing through names and dates. My clothes were damp and soiled, and the sky was heavy with the pre-dawn gray. The world looked muted, the details sharpened by exhaustion and fear. I staggered out of the cemetery. Only when I reached the road did I feel the ground solid beneath me. I looked for my bicycle, but it was gone. My phone, too, was missing. When I finally made it back to the village, I took hours to calm down enough to ask around for Jax. No one seemed to know what I was talking about. Faces twisted in concern or mild amusement. Some said they'd only ever seen me on my own, muttering to myself. That afternoon, I searched the entire village, even checking old pictures from any neighbors. There's no evidence Jax existed. Not a single soul remembered seeing him beside me. Not one. I'd always thought I was lonely, but I never doubted I was alone. For days, everything felt off. My reflection in the mirror seemed hesitant, as if lagging a fraction of a second behind my movements. My eyes stayed bloodshot for weeks, stinging when I tried to sleep. Whisper-thin bruises appeared on my arms, the shape of fingers, which I don't recall getting. Sometimes I think about the phrase scrawled on the church wall. If I'd looked behind, what would I have seen? Something wearing Jax's shape? Or only an empty church, and the truth fracturing inside my mind? It's been years since that night. The church is nothing but bones now, swallowed by weeds. Still, sometimes at the edge of sleep, I picture those marble angels with their shattered necks, their vacant gaze fixed on me. Every now and then, I catch a familiar silhouette in the fog, someone I know too well, waiting for me to follow. Or maybe it really was just me all along. Maybe grief and isolation twisted my memories, and I made my own ghost to keep me company. But that burning in my eyes and the words on the wall, I can't explain those. Not really. I haven't set foot near that church again. But in the dead of night, when everything is silent, I still remember. Never look behind. Story number 3. It's difficult to describe how a room can change when it's empty. When the light fades from the stained glass and the congregation filters away, a chapel stands hollow, not quite at rest, but holding its breath. My place within that hush has always been practical. Check that side doors are locked, candles snuffed, hymnals stacked. The church feels honest in those moments. Shadows and all, it belongs to itself. A few years ago, I'd started serving as assistant pastor, eager to prove myself, but by Sunday night, usually tired to the bone. That evening was winter damp, sky black as slate beyond the windows. My footsteps echoed over flagstones as I walked the nave, ticking chores off by memory. Everything remained, as always, touchable and explainable, until I reached the Lady Chapel. The Lady Chapel is older than the rest of the church. The wooden fittings are chipped, the paint on Mary's robes unrestored since the 70s. The silence there tastes like copper, as if sound has grown old and thin. That night, as I reached for the light switch, a whisper met me. At first, I thought it had drifted from the main sanctuary, a lost prayer maybe, or one last mourner. But then I realized the murmur came from inside the chapel itself. Peering around the arch, I saw her. She was hunched at the altar rail, clothed in pale folds too thin for the cold. Both hands gripped something tight, a bundle, swaddled in gray cloth, pressed to her shins. Her head hung low under a loose hood. Her voice was so faint it sounded like leaves scraping glass, and her words, even then, made half sense at best. My mind reeled for reasons. Maybe it was the cleaning lady, confused, an elderly visitor lost, but I didn't recognize her shape. I felt a crawling in my gut, a reminder of how old that room really was. Older than the parish roster, older than the stone. With a practiced calm, I tried to address her, but she raised one veined hand for silence without turning around, as if quiet was all she wanted from the world. The closer I crept, the colder it got. I could see my breath, a strange thing in mid-autumn, especially with the boiler running. My shoes stuck to the carpet with a faint, wet sound. It occurred to me that my little torch, shining on the prayer desk, cast not one but two shadows behind her, one thin and one terribly squat. The latter crouched on the wall near her hands. She still murmured, and piecing phrases together, I caught the words, bells, and almost awake, and a deep sigh that rustled deeper than her frame would allow. My mind flashed to the parish legends, the cracked bell that hadn't rung for 50 years, the passage in the vestry that never led quite the same place twice. I shook off the feeling. Surely, I reasoned, an elderly lady had simply wandered in, clutching some keepsake, but my certainty felt threadbare. I took another step and the woman shushed me, quick, sharp, commanding. Her head finally turned. I only saw her face in flashes, deep-shadowed, wet eyes sunk in darkness, her lips moving too fast for human speech. For a split second, it seemed the skin on her cheeks twitched on its own, badly fit, like parchment puckered in a draft. I tried again, my voice little more than a croak. She straightened with a sudden animal stiffness, bundle hugged tight to her chest. The wet patch under her knees had grown, darkening the musty carpet, with droplets pooling as if from a recent storm. I caught a copper tang in the air, a scent that never belonged to lilies or incense, but to rainwater leaching through old pipes or something half-decayed. She hissed, almost joyous, asking if I could hear bells. I heard nothing, but the hairs on my arms rose as if a great clock somewhere had started to tick. My heart pounded, but I tried to act. I left the chapel to fetch the vicar and the church warden. I remember the shriek of the hinges as I hurried, the absurd domesticity of finding Father John in the vestry, dunking biscuits in his tea. By the time we returned, less than 5 minutes certainly, the Lady Chapel was empty. Where the woman had crouched, the carpet glistened with a spreading wetness, impossibly icy. No trace of footprints led away. The bundle was gone. The vicar grumbled under his breath, blamed a draft, and the warden suggested maybe I'd glimpsed a confused widow from St. George's home. She'd vanished, they reasoned, gone out another exit, or slipped backstage. I wanted to agree, but in searching the side corridors, my torch flickered low every time I drew near the Lady Chapel. The light returned as soon as I stepped away. I finished my duties that night with care, ears sharp for the scrape of fabric or the sorrowful whistle of a bell. Candles by the Marian altar guttered and sparked with no wind, sneaking their shadows up the stonework into long, groping shapes. Unlocking the vestry later, I thought I smelled wet wool and cold mud. Over the following weeks, rumors swirled. Someone said water damage had left cold patches, and the vicar called in a handyman. No leaks were found. I pressed for more, questioned old churchgoers about the Lady Chapel, its former visitors, any funerals unaccounted for. The only story anyone recalled was about a pauper's burial during the war, a stillborn infant, the mother committed soon after. Skeptics nodded sagely. The mind plays tricks at dusk. But I started avoiding the Lady Chapel on winter nights, letting the warden lock it, inventing errands in far less ancient corners. The wet patch returned every few months, always impossible to dry, always cold as churchyard stone. Sometimes when all is quiet, my limbs prickle at the memory of that damp, coppery scent. I swore off late-night lockups alone. I convinced myself it could have been a sleepwalking visitor, or the restless grief of someone too lost to remember her own prayers. But once a month, more or less, the candles flicker just as I brush past. Sometimes, sitting in the nave, I imagine muffled bells, far away as if buried deep below the crypt. I keep wondering what was wrapped in that bundle, and whether somewhere beneath our prayers, something waits for the sound of bells to rouse it. A shape swaddled in soaking cloth, hunched beneath the altar, lulled by a stranger's voice. People tell me the mind cracks under strain, especially at dusk, especially alone. They may be right. Still, when I smell rain inside, when I spot a little pool glimmering blue in the shadows, I hurry my steps. And I never ever look into the Lady Chapel when I'm alone after dark. Not anymore. Story number 4. I took over as sacristan at St. Bartholomew's Cathedral in the autumn of my 37th year. The church is Victorian, a vast echoing vessel of sandstone older than the crow-haunted trees outside. My duties are simple: light maintenance, cleaning, and, most crucial, locking the building every night. We're what people call old-fashioned, with iron keys on rings, no alarms, no automatic lights. Every evening, after candlelight vespers flicker out and the last parishioner's footsteps vanish, I walk the full circuit, checking latches and bolts. St. Bartholomew's has always carried an air of chilly solemnity, but I never considered it menacing. My initial worry was rodents or vagrants, never anything stranger. There's a little closet off the old vestry on the north side, no bigger than a coffin, set with a heavy wooden door that doesn't match the rest of the church. The door is water-damaged and hung with a fat old brass lock from before the war. I was told it's just for candles, altar wine, odds and ends, and the only things I ever saw inside were a worn red pastor's stole on a hanger and a chipped porcelain crucifix nailed disposably to the back wall. The place always had a waxy yet faintly sour odor, like burned matches and spoiling flowers. My nightly round became routine. I always left the vestry till last, swinging my lantern and listening to my boots fade behind me, as if the vast nave hunched to swallow sound. I would check the little closet, run my thumb along the deadbolt, tug the handle, and watch the dust tremble when I locked it. Unspectacular, night after night until January. It was the coldest snap in years. The red velvet pew cushions crystallized with frost, and the wind rattled the stained glass, whistling through unfindable cracks. On one of those biting mornings, as I unlocked each door in turn, I found the closet's door ajar by an inch, chilling my hand with breath from inside. I blamed myself. Perhaps I'd fumbled the lock in the dark, or been distracted by thoughts of supper. I closed it tight, flickering the lantern's glow into the cramped interior. Everything in place, only the stoic crucifix and draped stole, still as death. The next day it was open again, not an inch more nor less. This time I pulled on the bolt before shutting the door, feeling it click with solid finality. I waited, counted to 10, and tried the handle. It held, stone still. Yet the next morning, the same thing. The closet was cracked open, exhaling a faint cold that made the small hairs on my arm rise. I started marking the lock with a dab of wax to make sure I'd sealed it. I even began snapping a picture with my phone before bed. By now I could not hide from myself the unspoken layering of unease. How the vestry's air thickened, carrying scents I'd never noticed. A strange metallic tang among the usual must, or, on certain nights, a sweetness similar to rotting apples. My keys would sometimes jangle without movement as I passed the closet, as if a passing truck jarred the stone. But outside all was still. Through it all no one else noticed. The priest teased me kindly, said it was just old buildings shifting, or hungry mice, or cross winds rattling ancient hinges. Still, every morning, I'd walk in and find the closet gaping like a throat. Then came the last morning. I remember the strange, oppressive quiet, a silence like being underwater, broken only by reverberating drops from a leaking tap in the sacristy. My breath hung in front of me. The closet door was, yet again, open. Inside, the air bit down hard and cold. The single window across the vestry was coated in condensation, as though the closet exhaled into the room. The stole wasn't on its hook. Instead, I found it lying in the thick dust on the floor. The ends were knotted tight together, the body of the stole twisted in a rough loop, unmistakably a noose. The crucifix had fallen diagonally, but oddly enough, it was propped against the wall as if set there deliberately. I examined the dust with my flashlight. There were no footprints, no disturbance except where the stole's ends dragged a faint line. My eyes scanned for rodents' prints, even the speck of a spider, but the dust lay undisturbed save for the unnatural arrangement in the center. The knot was elaborate, drawn taut with a precision I'd never associate with myself, or accidental shifting, or drafts. That night, as I made my final rounds, the cathedral bloomed with inexplicable sounds. The pipe organ grumbled as if a single low C had been pressed far away. The candle stands in the nave seemed to flicker all at once, their flames trembling. I kept to my duties as always, but the sensation grew, tiny scratches along my skin, as if unseen insects crawled up my arms. My flashlight, new batteries and all, dimmed and surged without warning as I stood beside the vestry door, the bulb casting shadows that didn't match the fixtures. I told myself I was tired, overwrought, frightened by what I couldn't explain. The days that followed were uneasy. I continued to mark the lock, tried replacing it, even left a chalk sigil on the closet's frame. No effect. The coldness near the door became more pronounced. Though the furnace was on full, my breath plumed only in that corner. Whenever I lingered near, my skin pimpled, and there was an urge, irrational yet impossible to ignore, to open the closet, to look inside despite knowing exactly what I'd find. Eventually, with the priest's blessing, I sealed it for good. Heavy plywood, new hardware. I bought the materials myself and stayed after sunset to fit them. Every hammer blow sounded muffled, as though the building itself swallowed the noise. When it was finished, the closet now just a seam in the wall, I stood there until the lights in the nave struggled and went out in a silent, synchronized shudder. Afterwards, I told myself there had to be an explanation. A trick of cold air, shrinking wood, a vibration in the stonework, perhaps even sleepwalking, a mental lapse, my mind undoing what my hands remembered securing. The noose, I said, was surely a tangle from falling, dragged by a settling draft or the release of tension in old cloth. But the unease never faded. Sometimes as I walk that side of the building, something colder than the night brushes my neck. Some mornings the scent of scorched wax still hovers, just for a moment, beneath the fresher, open air. I tell myself it's nothing. I have to believe it's nothing. But when I pass the place where the tiny closet stands, invisible and sealed, I walk a little faster. There's always a chill when I pass that patch of wall, sharp as a warning, reminding me that some things, maybe, aren't meant to be opened again. Story number 5. I was recently promoted to head pastor, a position I had worked toward for years. My congregation was modest, the church small but old and full of stories whispered in its corners. I wanted to be a steady leader, a comfort to my flock. But after the first restless night, all I can claim is that I never understood fully what crept into my life. My troubles began with a disjointed, outrageous event. It was early March, the days still quick to lose the light. Some bone-deep fatigue pressed me into bed that evening. I remember a dreamless void, then a shock of cold and wet grass. I came to myself under the choking orange glow of the porch lamp. My hands trembled. One was numb from grasping a kitchen knife, though I couldn't recall having left my bed. My nightshirt clung damply to me, my breath visible in the air. My family found me like that, bewildered and worried. I offered explanations I barely believed. Sleepwalking, some confusion with medications. But neither I nor they could read the look behind my own eyes, the pulse of dread at the base of my skull. The events compounded. It never happened the same way twice. Not entirely. A week after the lawn incident, I woke kneeling on the cold stone floor of the sanctuary. My hands were folded, my head bowed as though in prayer. Outside, the strange half-darkness of 3:17 a.m. filled the church. Not quite night, not approaching dawn. Only the drip of a leaky pipe somewhere broke the silence, echoing through the nave. The stained glass caught the moonlight oddly, colors running oily and wrong as they sprawled over my blank, unmoving face in the reflection of the altar's polished wood. From then on, this became routine. Every few nights, I would find myself in the sanctuary, hands tightly clasped, knees bruised, the hour always 3:17. The constancy of it gnawed at me. My family grew pale from worry. "It's probably stress," my wife would murmur, but her eyes lingered on the knife rack and the church doors each evening. Desperate for understanding, I set my phone to record my room through the night. It sat unnoticed on my dresser, lens angled toward the bed. The following morning, I watched the replay. I saw myself at 3:12 sit bolt upright, my body coiled and tense. My eyes stared wide and glassy at the far wall. After a long minute, my head turned, as if listening. I stood and moved with robotic precision, never looking at my hands or feet. Down the hall through the church's side door, I walked barefoot, the camera catching only the faint echo of motion. The video continued, spitting static. Then in the sanctum, my figure was visible at the altar. I was rigid, hands outstretched and pressed tight together. At 3:17 precisely, a flicker, barely detectable but undeniable, passed from left to right across the altar and seemed to bend the light. Blacker than shadow, slim and tall, a suggestion of movement that made my scalp crawl just from looking at its outline. Despite every light in the church being on, that shadow drank them in, made the air seem thick and heavy. It was gone in less than a heartbeat. For the next few frames, my lips moved in silent speech. Then I slumped to the floor, insensible. When I tried to show my wife, the video was simply gone, a blank, corrupted file on my phone. No matter how often I tried to reload it, no trace left, as if the file had never existed. There were other moments that made my skin prickle and my breath catch in my throat. Lights flickering on and off during the early hours, even after replacing the bulbs. An awful cloying smell, like burnt sugar or old meat, that seeped up from the floorboards of the sanctuary and dissipated only with dawn. Faint marks, a handprint clean of dust or sooty streaks, would appear on the altar cloth, then vanish by morning. I would wake each time more exhausted, as if some crucial part of me had left my body and barely crawled back before dawn. The line between waking and dreaming blurred with each day. Sometimes during services, I would catch a glimpse of movement, quick and purposeful, always just out of view, in a dark corner near the choir loft. Parishioners never seemed to notice. After one particularly dreadful night, I found tiny scratches at the base of my throat, almost like claw marks. The skin burned beneath my collar. I told my family and doctor that I must have done it myself in my sleep, some psychosomatic reaction to anxiety and disrupted rest. But then, the incident that lingers in me. I woke on the stone floor, breathless, pressure blooming on my neck like icy fingers. My hands, though empty, ached with a remembered grip. I staggered back to my room, heart pounding with a foreign rhythm. In the bathroom's fluorescent glow, I saw a dark bruise around my neck, a thin cut, almost surgical, shallow but precise, tracing my pulse. It had not bled. On the floor beside my bed lay the kitchen knife again, its edge clean and cold. The doctor's words, logical and simplistic, wrapped around the inexplicable. Stress ruins sleep. Faith leaders have breakdowns too. Yet I remembered vividly the tight certainty I had felt while kneeling in the sanctuary, the sense of being led by something as old as the church stones, something cold and watchful, into a ritual I could not recall. My prayers rang hollow after that. The church, once my second home, felt alien during the night. Motes of dust spiraled impossibly against the grain of the moonlight, drifting upwards like reverse snowfall. My hands often shook before turning the key at sunset. I felt each evening as if some presence in the sanctuary was waiting patiently for me to return for my next midnight vigil. Some nights I can almost convince myself, sleepwalking, stress-induced hallucinations, the remnant paranoia of an overworked mind. I watch the clocks, hide the knives, search for new cracks in logic to wedge myself into. Yet when 3:17 comes, I wake with dread, waiting for the familiar weight behind my eyes, the cold pull at my feet. It's been a year, never quite enough time to dismiss it as illness, never enough proof to surrender to a haunting. I keep serving, keep searching for meaning, but the unease will not leave. In the hush before dawn, my own footsteps echo back to me in the empty sanctuary. Some nights I almost expect to see that brief, awful shadow standing behind the altar, nodding as if I'd done precisely as instructed, and I wonder, a little more each day, what I might have brought upon us all. Story number 6. I never expected much from my job at St. Cecilia's. It was honest work. A few hours a night, sweeping the long, echoing hallways, wiping candle drips from oak benches, wrangling dust in the cavernous nave. The church was beautiful but tired, a hulking relic on the edge of the city, all splintered wood and frayed velvet, the kind of place where the air always tasted a little like cold stone and old wax. Most evenings I worked in complete solitude. Sometimes the wind flicked the stained glass and set color to moving on the tiles, but no one came in after dark. That night, Tuesday I think, the air felt suffocating and thick, buzzing with an energy hard to place. The dusk had stained the windows a deep red, and the nave seemed to crawl with shadows that clung to the bottoms of pews. I was kneeling, scrubbing a patch of spilled wax from the floor, when the silence was torn apart by an appalling clamor. The sound didn't build, it erupted out of nothing. I recognized it as the bell, but not as anyone who ever attended this church would have remembered it. This wasn't the slow, mellow toll for Sunday Mass or a gentle call for Vespers. It was a jittery, furious clanging, metallic and raw, reverberating in my sternum. It sounded entirely wrong. In that instant, the temperature seemed to drop, breath frosting in the air. Dust danced brightly in every crevice, as if lit from inside. St. Cecilia's bell tower had been sealed for years. When I started here, the parish priest told me the bell was removed after an accident, cracked beyond repair, and sold to a scrapyard. The upper rooms had been padlocked since, used only for storage. Old hymnals, rusty candlesticks, forgotten wooden crosses, and battered statues. I'd seen the thick, rusted locks, untouched for years. Yet the sound was unmistakably coming from above, from the bell room, a place that could not have a bell. Something compelled me upwards. My mind flickered through every rational explanation. Maybe some metal loose in the wind, or a rat shuffling old chains across the floor. But the pounding was rhythmical, purposeful, more like fists against steel than anything natural. I wiped my hands and forced myself through the chancel into the back, to the old stairwell. The staircase to the bell room curled up tight, a constricting spiral wrapped around itself. The air on those steps always felt stale, thick with the scent of forgotten things. Old wood, mold blooming behind the plaster, the sour sweetness of ancient incense. As I climbed, the steps moaned and shifted, and the ridged banister felt sticky with age. At the first turn, I stopped and listened. My own breath rattled. That was when I heard the footsteps, soft but deliberate, just ahead. Something heavy, shifting its weight, creaking on the warped stairs above. I knew I was alone. The last priest left hours before, and I had locked the only door behind me. I told myself it was old wood shifting, relaying the sound upward. I forced myself onward, clutching the banister. The footsteps continued for 3 more steps, then froze. Silence pressed in, nearly physical. The bell's vibrations faded as abruptly as they began, replaced by the dense hush of stone. At the top landing, I saw the door, a slab of battered wood, set crooked in the frame. The lock, thick with rust, hung solidly in place, heavy with time. No one had gone through there in years. Dust lay so thick across the threshold that it was completely undisturbed, not a toe print or smudge. I pressed my hand to the door. Beneath my palm, it vibrated gently, barely perceptible, a hum, almost alive, like a bone-deep trembling. But the lock hadn't moved. With my nerves frayed as thin as string, I started back down. I moved carefully, afraid to trust the ancient boards. Somewhere between the middle and the bottom, I felt a sudden shift in the air, a pressure, a flash of cold so fierce I gasped. For a second, something pressed hard into my back, an invisible, forceful shove, unreal in its intent. My foot skidded off the edge of the stair, and I felt myself lurch forward. Only the shock and the slick fear in my stomach made my hands clutch the rail so tight my knuckles ached. If I'd missed, I would have fallen down the stairs, bone meeting stone at an unnatural angle. Heart hammering, I braced myself and kept going. By the time I reached the last step, sweat was freezing in the ridges of my neck. That was when I remembered the chandelier, a monstrous, many-armed thing that dangled in the foyer, right at the base of the stairs. I'd long stopped trusting it. The fixture was nearly as old as the church, and during windstorms it swayed eerily, crystal petals chiming against each other. I stepped aside out of habit, and then, in a churning hail of noise and glass, the chandelier wrenched free. Metal screamed as it ripped from the ceiling, plummeting past my arm and smashing into the tiles with a force that made the air shudder. Shards skidded in every direction. If I'd been 3 inches to the left, I would have taken it on the head. I could smell ozone, scorched electricity, sharp lime from dusted old stone. Every hair on my arm stood upright. Broken glass littered the ground in patterns that caught the dying light, glinting like the eyes of 100 tiny animals. The silence after was nearly unbearable. I didn't clean up the chandelier. I told myself the old ceiling had finally given way, that my mind was frayed from too many overnights in the chill, haunted dark. And yet, as I left, I felt eyes in the empty alcoves, the gaze of the statues carved into the archways, watching, judging. Before I slipped through the doors, I thought I heard the bell again, a faint, dying song, so weak I might have imagined it. A week passed before I stepped foot in St. Cecilia's again, and never after sundown. The priest asked me about the chandelier and scolded me for my carelessness. I couldn't tell him the truth, not in words that made sense even to myself. Since then, on restless nights, I sometimes awake to the sound of bells. No longer a clangor, but a thin, persistent ringing that seems to seep through the walls, threading between my thoughts, right at the edge of hearing. Whenever I turn in bed, I feel the faintest brush at my back, cold and insistent, as if warning me that I was never meant to reach the top of those stairs. I remind myself the mind plays tricks in silence. Old buildings sag and sigh. A chandelier falls because rust eats at its bones. But some nights I wake with a cry trapped in my throat, my heart stumbling over itself, and I remember, in that empty, locked bell room, something waited. Nothing visible, nothing provable, but something that rang for me, and almost made sure I never left the church at all. Story number 7. Last spring, I would have described my job as simply challenging, a constant parade of spilled juice, wild giggles, and the usual impossible questions kids ask. I am the children's pastor after all. I'd gotten used to all manner of oddities, crayons mashed into hymnals, sticky fingerprints on the pulpit, squeaky shoes echoing down the halls. But what started happening in mid-March was different, and no amount of cheerful optimism could iron out the shivers it gave me. Monday mornings were meant for quiet. After the riot of Sunday school, our church always feels strangely hollow. Cold stone, high archways, tired sunlight limping through stained glass. That first week back after the youth retreat, I found something hovering in the sanctuary. A single red balloon, glossy and bobbing gently right at eye level, tethered to nothing. My first thought was a leftover party favor, maybe a token from some birthday I hadn't registered. I popped it, expecting a sharp snap, but instead it simply sagged and let out an odd whispering sigh, deflating with a slow, secret sort of defeat. The second week, there it was again. Same color, same spot, drifting above the rows of pews. I made a joke about the balloon bandit during announcements, hoping to coax a confession out of one of the kids, but everyone just gave me blank smiles. No one claimed it. No one met my gaze for more than a second. Curiosity got the best of me by the third week. I decided to leave the balloon be and just watch. Nobody saw me, I made sure of it. I snuck in after morning coffee, shoes silent on the old marble floor, and hid in the upper balcony, breath steaming in the early light. The balloon hovered at the end of the central aisle, nodding as if waiting for some unseen guest. It began to drift, slowly, almost ceremoniously, down the aisle, moving with a strange purpose as though it were being guided by invisible hands. It stopped dead in front of the baptismal font. The air changed. Trembling cold spidered up my arms and down my back, as if I'd walked straight into a freezer. The balloon collapsed, not with a bang, but a soft gasp, the latex cinching in on itself like lungs exhaling for the last time. I could feel my breath suspended in the dreadful hush that followed, the chilled air pinching my cheeks. I checked the classrooms, the storage cupboards, all the usual hiding spots for mischief. Nothing. Everything smelled flat and stale, except for a lingering trace of something faintly metallic, like old coins or watered-down blood, where the balloon had been. My nerves frayed further when, the next Monday, the same sequence played out. Balloon, aisle, font, that cold, sighing deflation. I was starting to dread Mondays, my confidence curdling away. I tried asking the kids again, in private and in groups, joking and serious. They looked startled, puzzled, unconcerned. One even laughed at me, but it wasn't reassuring. It had a brittle edge, like he was grateful the attention wasn't on him anymore. I turned to proof, something objective, something rational. We have security cameras set up throughout the sanctuary, part of the church's new safety initiative, and I sat down that afternoon with our IT guy to go through the footage, hour by hour. The first time I saw it, a red flash, the floating balloon halting in that shaft of colored light. It looked off, as if the signal had been chewed. As the balloon moved, the screen pixelated, the image garbled in rainbow static. 12 seconds of nothing, every single time the balloon came into frame. I asked the IT guy to replay it for me, pointing out the moment. He squinted at the flat screen, shook his head. There were no glitches, he said, not on his end. He scrubbed through the recording, crystal clear. He gave me a friendly, puzzled smile and said, "Maybe I needed sleep. Maybe the wiring was acting up. Churches this old, after all, are built on unreliable foundations." That night, alone in the sanctuary, I tried to explain it to myself. A draft, maybe. Sanity clings to explanations when the alternative is believing your eyes. Spring winds slip through cracks in 100-year-old mortar. Balloons from birthdays, commercial-grade latex, maybe a short in the wiring to mess with the cameras. A prank. Kids love a prank. This was their kind of magic trick. In my dreams, though, I began to see things I couldn't explain away. The balloon, looming larger each time, bobbing just beside my ear. Sometimes I dream in black and white, only the balloon retaining its color, red as an exit wound. Sometimes in the half-dream, I heard singing, children's voices echoing old liturgies, but the words were warped and backwards. If I'm honest, being alone in that building started to bother me. The church, usually a comfort, seemed suddenly crowded with shadow. I'd walk the pews Monday mornings, flicking on every light. More than once, I was sure I saw something hunkered between two pews, a dark, child-sized shape, hunched and still. Only ever out of the corner of my eye, and always gone by the time I looked. There were other little things too. The faint scent again, metallic, like the moist edge of a penny coming from the baptismal font after the balloon dissolved. Wax figures on the children's altar rearranged themselves. Subtle shifts I almost didn't notice. Half an inch one way or the other, their faces turned. One morning I came in to find sticky fingerprints on the windows, smaller than any of the kids in my programs. More Mondays passed. Sometimes the balloon wasn't there, but then other oddities grew sharper. A cold draft even on warm days. Organ pipes humming low and tuneless when the church lay empty. Sunday school paintings flapping on the walls despite closed windows. I told myself over and over that the church was old, that the mind plays tricks when you expect to see something, that sound travels strangely down the nave, that electricity skips and fuses blow, that children are notoriously unreliable witnesses. But the hair on my arm still pricks up every time I enter the sanctuary alone. Sometimes in the second before the church lights all flicker to life, I find myself holding my breath, scanning the pews for that shifting shadow. Every now and then, I glimpse a red balloon, bobbing gently in my mind's eye, waiting patiently by the baptismal font, and I have to remind myself sharply that there's nothing there. After all, things only seem unexplainable until you find your reasoning. The church is old. Balloons appear and vanish. Cold air sinks in old stone buildings. Security footage glitches. Shadows gather where they must. But each Monday, as I flick on the lights and scan for the shape of a child that isn't there, I can't quite shake the dread that something else is waiting to be found. Some sliver of truth floating invisible and just out of reach, like a single red balloon drifting over ancient pews. Story number 8. I've been the caretaker for St. Mary's for 11 years, and it's never bothered me to arrive before dawn on Sundays. I'd unlock the heavy oak doors at 6:30 a.m., my breath misting in the new chill of spring. My boots would echo on the stone as I made my way to the back, to the little marble baptismal font that stood beneath a stained glass window. In those sleepy moments before the congregation arrived, the church felt like mine alone, hushed and peaceful. Maybe that's why I noticed almost immediately when the font began to act strangely. It started one Sunday in April. My routine never changed. Unlock church, check the candles, make sure the hymn books are in place, and always pause by the font. The marble was old and pitted, but the water inside was usually still, catching the colored light from the glass above. That morning, though, I saw it moving. Just a slow, careful swirl, circling inward like a fingertip had been run round the rim. I brushed it off then. Maybe I'd bumped the font, or maybe a draft ran through the nave. These old buildings are always shifting, full of cracks and hollows. Yet by the following week, I'd find the water circling again, always in the same tight spiral, always controlled and smooth. Each time I'd stop, waiting for the air to settle or for a sound. Silence. I'd be by myself, the doors still locked, the church heavy with the weight of dusk. It felt innocent enough to dismiss, yet my hands would tremble each time I dipped them in, like I was disturbing something that didn't want to be touched. One particular Sunday, well into May, I bent to inspect the water closer. My face hovered just above the marble surface, breath fogging over the ripples. The room was gray and still, and there, in the glassy surface, I saw a dark shape behind my own head. It stood tall, a wavering silhouette, roughly human, but with no detail or color. Just a shadow, but solid. It was as if someone stood in the aisle behind me, unmoving, watching. A cold sweat burst over me. I spun around, my heart hammering wildly, half expecting to see someone perched over my shoulder. But there was nothing. Only the stretch of empty pews, the rising light seeping through stained glass. Not a sound save for the creak of the building settling. I laughed weakly at myself. There's logic for these things. A trick of light, the mind filling in details, the fatigue of an early morning. Still, the memory festered. I obsessed over it, replaying that moment in my head as I went about my evenings. I convinced myself it meant nothing. The puddles at my house started a few weeks later. I don't live extravagantly. My place is a squat, square rental halfway up Quarry Hill, a 15-minute walk from the church. I keep it tidy. Old habits die hard for caretakers. That rainy April had passed, and most nights were still and dry. Yet on a Wednesday, fatigue mounting, I returned from running errands to find a neat puddle of water pressed into the middle of my kitchen floor. It was perfect. Not a drop on the counters, no dripping from the tap, just a pool of water as if someone had cracked open a pipe from underneath. I mopped it up, checked the plumbing, nothing. It became routine. Every few days a new puddle would show, sometimes small, sometimes spreading, always contained, never running off in streaks as a spill would. I checked the ceiling for leaks, the drains, the washing machine. Nothing made sense. The landlord shrugged. "Old house," he said. "Bad pipes. The place is probably sweating in the spring humidity." But one night in late June, I woke parched, rolling from my bed with the unease that can only settle in the deep hours of the morning. I shuffled through the hall to the kitchen for a glass of water. As I walked past the living room, my toes found cold liquid, soaking into the seam of my socks. There, in the dead center of the room, was a wide black puddle, perfectly round and completely silent. A cold draft coasted through the room. My skin prickled. I bent down, half-crouched, peering into the shiny surface. I expected just my own tired face, but what I saw tore all reason out of me. A head, not mine, gazed up from the water. Dark voids for eyes, its hand, elongated, too thin, extended outward through the surface like it might break free from its watery prison. My lungs locked. I stumbled back, my spine thumping into the wall, wet tracks left by my feet smearing across the hardwood. The air turned glacial. I hurled myself down the hallway and slammed my bedroom door, chest shuddering in panic. It took hours for my heart to slow, but I never slept that night. Every time the wind rattled the windows, my skin crawled with the memory of that hand rising from the water. Morning couldn't come soon enough. I left the living room closed as I hurried to the church. When I got there, I avoided the font, afraid to even look at the water, but routine governed me. Candles, hymnals, and eventually I had to check it. The water was still, but the air above it was icy. I found the pastor in his office, hesitant, summoning the nerve to describe what I'd seen. He stared at me for a long moment. Finally, he told me quietly that there's always been a cold spot near the font, and he didn't know why. He gave no further explanation, a shrug, a tremor under his calmness. Old stories, maybe. Old stone, old water, old ghosts, said a superstitious part of me. But is that what it was? Or just condensation and exhaustion weaving together, the way early mornings warp things? I still check the font every Sunday. The water sometimes swirls, sometimes does not. Sometimes when my eyes catch a shape in the reflection, I pause, heart thudding, hair prickling along my arms. And I remind myself things can always be explained, but the puddles come and go at home. The chill in the church never leaves that one spot. I leave lights on at night, and I've stopped looking too closely into reflective surfaces, lest I see a hand or a face waiting for me. People tell me it's nothing, that old buildings play tricks on tired minds. Maybe they're right. And yet, every week, I feel the cold settling a little deeper in my bones.